Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Woodman, and I want to welcome you to my YouTube channel. In this video, we will look at what immigration laws and reforms were like after the post-war era. In December 1943, after 60 years, the United States finally repealed the 1882 law barring the Chinese from entering the United States. It also allowed the Chinese to apply to become naturalized citizens. It was to wipe clean the stain on America's human rights record, but repealing the Chinese Exclusion Act was not easy. The United States was supporting an ally, in this case China was allied with the United States in World War II, an important staging area for American troops. And don't forget the naturalization part. Chinese immigrants could now become citizens. For example, Edward Bing Hen was naturalized 1 month and 1 day after the law went into effect. He had an advantage by working as a translator for the Immigration and Naturalization Service for 35 years. For everyone else, it wasn't so easy. There were tens of thousands of Chinese made eligible by the new law. How many of them became citizens? Fewer than 800 in all of 1945. And race was officially a reason to deny a person the right to become a citizen. It would take almost 10 more years for that to change. Although, again, in a law, a good bit more dubious than it pretended to be. In 1952, a law called the McCarran-Walter Act was passed to remove race from the qualifications for citizenship. However, this act was written to make sure that most of the quota would be filled by the same Northern Europeans who had been getting in all along. The main focus was keeping out people whose politics did not match those in charge of the American government. The McCarran-Walter Act required anyone suspected of being a communist to register as a foreign agent, and people deemed subversive could be imprisoned without trial or deported. Naturalized citizens could have their citizenship revoked without any proof that they had committed a crime. However, these politicians argued, quote, "We were protecting the United States from an invasion from within. These people came here to destroy the nation," unquote. On the other hand, this was what they said about the Japanese. In 1965, Senator Philip Hart and Representative Emanuel Celler of Brooklyn wrote the first genuine loosening of immigration law since 1790, called the Hart-Celler Act. But it wasn't perfect. They said, quote, "I was one of the few who spoke out against the Johnson-Reed Act, and I opposed the McCarran-Walter Act. After 40 years in Congress, this bill was my proudest achievement. I came into Congress in 1924. I believed then that a diverse America is a stronger America, and I believe it now. This is the United States Congress. Nothing is perfect, but we ended the national origins formula. It opened up immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, Asia, the Near and Middle East, all the groups that had barred before," unquote. But there was still a formula with limits. They said, quote, "True, we didn't have open borders. There weren't then members of Congress who would have voted for that. I'm not sure I would have, but we set our formulas as fairly as possible, I think," unquote. Sooner or later, the United States was becoming a more welcoming nation. Legal immigration, which comprised only 38,000 people in 1945, had risen to over 250,000 when the Hart-Celler Act was signed by President Lyndon Johnson in 1965. Making the process fair to immigrants from all nations inside Northern Europe was an important step. The United States also prioritized immigrants joining family members in the United States and those with certain skills. The same year, a key right of citizenship was restored to a group from which it had been stolen away. Does that mean we are all done with immigration issues and reforms? Not exactly. There were still some modifications to immigration policy. After 2 centuries of resisting diversity, the United States openly embraced it. Then, in 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed an immigration law that established a diversity immigrant visa. Anyone outside the United States who wanted to become a permanent resident entered a lottery. Each year, 55,000 applicants would be chosen and, for identification, would be given a green card. It came to be known as the Green Card Program. Millions and millions each year for one of those treasured 55,000 spots. The program tries specifically to encourage citizens of countries who have historically had low immigration, But what no one publicized was that most of the visas were meant to go to Irish and Italians who couldn't get into the country in any other way or were here illegally. During the first 3 years of the program, 40% of the visas were reserved for Ireland. So it was essentially geared and selected to specific countries during its initial start. No matter how it started, the green card has now become one of the most prized possessions of immigrants across the globe. However, opponents say, quote, it's a terrible program that lets in criminals, rapists, and drug dealers, and terrorists. This country was better off when all our immigrants were white. The 1790 law was the best. Let's go back to it, unquote. As you can tell, the resistance would still be here as long as non-white immigrants were entering the United States, no matter what reforms were happening. People from Mexico have been crossing into the United States to work since the gold rush. Until the Border Patrol was formed in 1924, they could pretty much come and go or stay as they please. They could just slip across the river and no one thought to kick them out. Until 1940, when people, quote, indigenous to the Western Hemisphere, unquote, like Mexicans were declared to be white, so they could be naturalized. But the quota stayed, so only a few became citizens. In 1954, the government initiated a deportation campaign where many Mexicans were shipped back to Mexico, despite some of them being American citizens. It was reasoned that it did not matter because what was good for the Japanese was good for the Mexicans. For a while, border crossings stayed low, but farmers and growers desperately needed inexpensive labor so they could work long hours under terrible conditions. Asians were no longer available, so Latin Americans were in great demand. People thought they were better off on American farms than they were at home, but this was the same argument they used to say about enslaved people. For many Latin Americans, terrible economic conditions and fear of gang violence made coming into the United States illegally or remaining here after coming in legally worth the risk. There were accusations that, quote, they're criminals, rapists, and drug dealers, unquote, like what President Trump said before. However, every study shows that undocumented immigrants are less likely to commit crimes than native-born Americans. There were accusations that, quote, they're parasites, stealing resources from real Americans. They come here just to go on welfare, unquote. However, every study shows that undocumented immigrants benefit the economy and boost growth. They pay more in taxes than they take out, do jobs that no one else wants, and help keep prices down. In 2012, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which is called DACA, allowed those who had entered the country illegally as children and were now between 15 and 30 years old to avoid deportation for 2 years, which is renewable, and get a work permit for that time. These children were Americans in every way, and studies showed that they were among the most patriotic and hardworking people of that age in the country, sort of the way children of Japanese immigrants were a century before. We got doctors, teachers, social workers, etc. Almost 750 million in the first 3 years. The Obama administration expanded it 2 years later to include any child and also parents of what we call dreamers, who have lived in this country for at least 5 years. Opponents of DACA think they are still here illegally and should be deported, but this is the only country they have ever known. As you can see, these reforms and modifications to immigration will keep happening over and over again that will either make the United States more or less welcoming to immigrants. No matter what, it remains unclear if someone will be sure they won't be sent away from the United States where they were born and have lived all their life. The thing we are seeing is depending on who is the president of the United States, that person will either be more or less strict on immigration policies. That makes it difficult to be consistent on who can immigrate to the United States and if we are making it easier or harder to provide pathways to citizenship for immigrants. While a lot of exclusionary policies were repealed, new ones came up that seemed like a replacement for them, but just executed differently. In the next video, we will conclude this video set series by providing a recap on the history of U.S. citizenship and belonging. Until then, please like this video, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and turn on the post notifications so you will be notified when I post my next video. I appreciate your support. Remember, you are powerful, you are capable, and you are the changemaker our society needs. Thank you so much for watching this video. I will see you soon.